On this Atlantic preview edition of Locked On NHL, it's the division that holds the teams with the 3 longest playoff droughts actively in the entire league. Will there be new blood in the Atlantic? All that and more on today's Atlantic Division Hopeful Locked On NHL.
This is the Locked On Podcast Network's 2024 NHL season preview. Your team every day.
Welcome into another preview of Locked On NHL, your team every day. We're a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we have local experts on the biggest stories. Very pleased to be joined by a panel of hosts that have covered more losses than they would have liked over the last season, but a lot of hope around the table as well. I'm Ross Levitan. You can find me 5 days a week over at Locked On Ottawa Senators, and I will introduce the panel right after I tell you that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. It's the official sports betting partner of Locked On. Make sure to check out FanDuel for all the latest props, including which Atlantic teams you think are going to make the playoffs this season. I'm joined by Joe DiBiase of Locked On Buffalo Sabres, Laura Saba from Locked On Canadiens, and Brian Fisher from Locked On Detroit Red Wings. Joe, I'm going to send it over to you, man. 13 years, the Buffalo Sabres, since they've last seen playoffs. Give me some hope in Buffalo. What's holding on for the fans that this could be the year to get out of that funk?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I think I might have more years of missing the playoffs than you three combined. Maybe it's close. I don't know. I was in high school the last time this team made the playoffs, so it's been a long time. And I do think fans are really efforting to try to have a lot of hope. But there is a couple of reasons I think to have hope this year. One is a new coach, and yeah, it's a familiar face. They're definitely playing on the nostalgia, no doubt, but I do think that they brought in the exact type of coach they were looking for, more of a veteran style coach that can mature these players to where they need to be. And I do think the Sabres got a lot better defensively. I think that's been their biggest problem for the last 3 years, and I do think it's maybe even going to be their strength going into this year. Hope meter's maybe about half full right now.
We'll get into breakout candidates. We'll get into the offseason additions for all the teams around this table. Brian Fisher's with us from Locked On Red Wings. The Yzer-Plan has been going a few years now. Give me the temperature in Detroit.
The temperature right now in Detroit, I don't know. I don't want to speak for the entire city. I'm kind of nervous, man. I'm a little nervous. And I think that's just because the Red Wings got so close last year. But as far as like temperature towards making the playoffs and not having been there in, I think, going on 8 years now, there's a little bit of angst amongst the fan base going now for sure. And I'm one of those people. But at the same time, I see the linear progression this team has made year in and year out. And I just getting so close and not making it last year really, really stings. And I think really upped the ante. But I think there's still hope in Hockeytown that can get done this year.
8 years without the postseason for the Detroit Red Wings, 7 for my Ottawa Senators. So except for the whole getting close, I'll just say same as Brian. It's a fan base that certainly has higher expectations than what's been delivered. Laura, I don't even know where to go with this because they finished last of all these teams. But the Montreal Canadiens, they have 18,000 watching their prospects play against the Leafs last week. It feels like despite their position from last year's standings, the vibes are high in Habs land.
It's all hope here. And I think that to me is the biggest thing, is that it was a disappointing finish, obviously, last year. It's going to be a disappointing finish this year. We are going to get into that a little bit later. But everything in Montreal is just screaming hope right now, whether you're talking about the prospects, whether you're talking about the offseason acquisitions, whether you're talking about we don't have a good name for it. You guys have the Yzer-Plan. There was the Shanna Plan. In Montreal, I don't even know what we're going to call the plan. There's no pun for it, right? And if you guys can come up with one, I'd be very grateful to you. But in Montreal, it's a lot of optimism. They're only 3 years away from a Stanley Cup final berth. It was a very interesting downward trajectory in that the entire time it went from absolute misery to hope in a very short amount of time. And I think there's still a couple of years of not being able to make the playoffs where the hope will still be there. Like there'll be a couple of years where it's still not a disappointment. So it's a very, very interesting time in Montreal. I was actually at one of the prospect showcase games, and they had it looked almost like a full house, right? And people were on the edge of their seats, for a game that for all intents and purposes means nothing to the fan base. It's a big thing for the rookies themselves. It's a big thing for the organization. But for a game that meant so little, to have the fans jumping out of their seats because a particular player touched the puck, I think, Montreal is a good place to be a hockey fan right now.
And we'll get into why more with some of their smart offseason acquisitions, including Patrick Laine, among others. Some big names coming to the Atlantic, but there's already some big teams. Let's go through it. It's 8 years in a row for the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Boston Bruins making the playoffs. 7 straight years for the Tampa Bay Lightning. The Florida Panthers, only 5, but they're all going to be collecting Stanley Cup rings at some point next season. Brian, what gives you any sort of reason to believe that one of those 4 teams could miss the playoffs this upcoming season?
Well, there's 2 particular teams that come to mind. One of them is the Tampa Bay Lightning. Last year, they finished in the wild card. They lost Stamkos. They traded away Sergachev. They did get McDonough back, who had a nice bounce-back season with the Nashville Predators. And they did, of course, sign Jake Gensel. But this is a team that is getting older. They're close to the salary cap, which they've done a nice job of maneuvering around. But it feels as if now they are in the latter half of their window. So I'm not saying they're going to miss this year, but I feel like they're finally starting to trend downward. The other team, and I hesitate to say this, the Boston Bruins, I feel like I say this every single year. This is the year they're going to fall off, but they lost half of their Vezina winning tandem, right? Like Linus Ullmark won a Vezina, 2 seasons ago, traded him away, still have not signed Jeremy Swayman, and they don't have the proof that Jeremy Swayman on his own can carry the load of being the starting goaltender of the Boston Bruins. It's going to be a huge test for them this year. And of course, they still really lack center depth. I know they kind of addressed that in the offseason by majorly overpaying, but I still don't have a lot of faith in their forward depth down the middle.
Yeah, Boston, absolutely a team that I am done saying, like, I'm picking against them. Last year, I went all in on it. Like, okay, one of the worst center groups I thought on paper in the league going into that season, and it just didn't matter, right? Like their system is so strong, the wingers are so talented, their goaltending was so good that they got there, and their centers produced because, hey, you play Charlie Coyle with Pastrnak, and suddenly Charlie Coyle looks like a top 6 centerman. So I feel like my lesson's been learned on Boston, that I can't pick against them anymore until I actually see it. I'm not really all that confident that any of these top 4 teams could fall out.
Laura at this round table is the one who could recognize the media pressure of playing in those 2 metropolises in Toronto and Montreal. For me, it's what if the Leafs get off to a slow start and Austin Matthews now wearing the C, the pressures kind of shift off of the even-keeled John Tavares to a guy who wears his heart a little bit more on his sleeve in Austin Matthews. And sure enough, he could have 30 goals by Christmas and nobody would be surprised. But again, if the Leafs are going to take a step back, it would probably be early on in the season. I think if they find their rhythm early on, they could be all right. Whereas the Florida Panthers, for me, I'm looking at them as a team where they've now had 2 long playoff runs back to back, and that starts to wear on a team. You saw the Tampa Bay Lightning ultimately fall in a similar situation when they went final, and now a pair of first-round exits. But Laura, what do you think that pressure is going to be like on the Leafs? And are they your pick, or give me your choice as a team who could fall back?
I would love for it to be the Leafs because I think everybody in this room would have the most fun with that. There is a little bit to be said about the pressure that they have, and they have to live up to it very soon. Like their window is closing and everyone can see that. They're making very strange decisions sometimes. And I feel that it's exactly like you said, they can lose the season in October, right? And that's what you want to watch out for. But for me, my pick is actually going to be Boston. And I feel like they've outplayed their roster construction for the last couple of years. Not to say that they're a terrible team, but you're doing that and you've lost a significant portion of what made you successful, much like Brian said. That's my pick to be out, but I would really, really love for it to be the Leafs.
Time will tell. But if history repeats itself, the Leafs, like I mentioned at the start of the segment, tied with the Boston Bruins for the longest active postseason streak with 8 years apiece. Now, FanDuel, our great friends over at FanDuel, always know a little more than we do. And they have their points totals over and under for our 4 teams to make the postseason. I take no pride in the Senators being first at 91.5 points. They're over under. The Detroit Red Wings 90.5, Buffalo 88.5, and the Montreal Canadiens 75.5. Should we snap it around real quick? Joe DiBiase, hit me with a team that you think is going. Which team do you think is most egregiously misplaced with their number?
I might think Montreal just because they're so far below the pack. Like, I still would put them fourth out of the four, no doubt, but an 11-point difference between them and everybody else. Again, if I was setting it, maybe it'd be like a 5 or a 6-point difference. So I'm not saying they'd be in that top three for me. But I think I would put Montreal a little bit higher, and I might put Ottawa a point or two a little bit above as well. Like, I don't have a problem with where the Sabres are there and Detroit. I think Ottawa's the most complete roster of the four. I know they have not lived up quite to expectations yet, but if you look at all three phases, you look at the forwards and the scoring they have up top, you look at the talent they have on the blue line, and now that they have Linus Ullmark in goal, who I've been watching for a long time, and we all saw produce in Boston, if he can stabilize that net, even if it's only for 1 year, I think Ottawa's the most complete roster, so I'd put them a little bit above the rest, but I don't have any severe problem with any of the four.
Well, we'll discuss that in the next segment, Joe, and we talk about our biggest acquisitions, because a lot of Bruins fans, a lot of NHL fans have said, yeah, Linus Ullmark was great. Look at the team in Boston in front. I said, no, look at the numbers in Buffalo on a not-so-good team. More on the big acquisitions who came to the playoff hopefuls in the Atlantic Division. You're listening to a very special preview edition of Locked On NHL, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On NHL is brought to you by FanDuel. It's America's #1 sports book. It's FanDuel. FanDuel is my favorite place to go when I'm looking to feel a little something on a game, even if I'm not super interested in it. All of a sudden, I go, put a unit, and I'm feeling great. So you can too with FanDuel. You can always check out all the latest odds, all the latest props, and parlays over at FanDuel. It's America's #1 sportsbook. It's also the official partner of the Locked On NHL. You just heard us talk about the over-unders for the season. You can bet on that. You can bet on awards. You can bet on it all at FanDuel. So go and get the new customers $150 bonus bets. Who doesn't love free bets? You can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet by just going to FanDuel.com/locked-on. That's FanDuel.com/locked-on. New customers, $150 in bonus bets. You just have to win a $5 bet. FanDuel, it's the official sports betting partner of the Locked On Podcast Network. Welcome back to a season preview edition of Locked On NHL. You can find all of our local experts on the biggest stories 5 days a week on the Locked On Podcast Network. You can find us on YouTube, free and available wherever you get podcasts. Just search Locked On, your favorite team, right here. Laura, your team made the most recent big splash, acquiring Patrik Laine. Was that the biggest offseason move, or did it happen a couple months earlier at the draft?
I think it was definitely the draft. You know, it sets them up for their future. Getting Ivan Demidov was a huge, it was a lot of luck. It was a huge home run, obviously. I think people were generally happy with that draft. I think, you know, we were expecting something to happen, and I think the Canadiens got the best player they possibly could have gotten that will fit in with their future plans. So that was a big reason. And you know, we were not even recovered from that excitement when they traded for Patrik Laine. I think that's a huge short-term acquisition, and that's why I agreed with Joe, you know, when he said I would put Montreal's odds a little bit higher with that point total, because Patrik Laine is going to make a huge impact. It's undeniable that Patrik Laine has a massive amount of talent. And I think, you know, his playmaking ability is extremely underrated. Like on Locked On Canadiens, we had David St. Louis of Elite Prospects, EP Ringside, who kind of broke down what he brings to the game in terms of being a playmaker. He's not known for that. That's not what people credit him for. I'm not going to sit here and say his defensive game is great, but he, you know, offensively, he brings a lot of talent. He's expected to play with Kirby Dach, who creates a lot of space for a player like that. He's great at finishing. He's great at scoring goals. So I'm really, really excited to see what that is going to look like. And, you know, I don't think that Montreal is going to be the team that breaks in and makes the playoffs and, you know, dethrones Toronto or Boston or something. But I do think that it's going to be a lot more fun to watch Montreal. And I think that a lot of the players are going to have their game kind of bettered by having Patrik Laine around.
And the Detroit Red Wings were active this offseason. I think they brought in every other goalie available at one point. Who's the biggest addition for you?
Well, it'd be cheating to say keeping Patrick Kane, but he would be my number one if he qualified because they signed him like 6 hours before free agency started. So I'll go with Vladimir Tarasenko, somebody who you are intimately familiar with, Ross. He played 3/4 of a season with the Senators last year. They lost David Perron to your Senators, and they needed a top 6 scoring punch. He's not the 40-goal scorer he used to be, but he's still got a cannon of a shot on that wing, and he's likely going to play on a second line with Patrick Kane, who's very capable of feeding Vladimir Tarasenko. So I think there's a lot of excitement for that second line. I know JT Compher is not he's not going to make people be wowed at the idea of him being the second line center, but he was a very good second line center last year for the Red Wings. I think just coming shy of his career high in points with the Red Wings. So I think that second line has quite an incredible scoring punch, although I'm not thrilled to see that line play defense because Tarasenko and Kane are not very well known for playing that. But I think in terms of, trying to replace some of the offense that they lost last year, especially like Daniel Sprong going to the Vancouver Canucks, Tarasenko is going to go a long way to making sure this team keeps scoring goals as they try to improve defensively.
I was honestly surprised at Tarasenko's all-around ability in Ottawa, and I know it was a different situation, and he got off to a hot start playing with Ridley Gregg and Matthew Joseph, but he was actually the Senators' leader. I know plus-minus isn't everything, but plus 13 on a team that had a pretty brutal goal differential, I thought was pretty impressive, and was able to maintain a pace that I wasn't sure was still possible at his I don't even think he's that old, going into his 33-year-old season, but never was a speed demon to begin with, but certainly a very heady and smart player. Joe, what's new in Buffalo? We know that they lost Jeff Skinner buyout, and that's a big change. He's been a staple there for the better part of a decade. What's the biggest addition that everyone's excited about in Sabres land?
Yeah, the joke on Sabres Twitter right now, by the way, is they bought out Jeff Skinner to pay for their new scoreboard, which might only be a joke. I won't confirm nor deny whether or not that actually might have happened. So that's more the negative end of things. The more optimistic end of things is, I might say their biggest acquisition, if I could even hit the rewind button all the way to the trade deadline, is getting a full season of Bowen Byram. And that's definitely a high risk, low reward type of move. I mean, he's had concussion problems. He was very up and down in Colorado. He's a high talent, top 5 pick for a reason, and he's flashed that talent when he showed up in Buffalo, scored on his first shot on goal for the Sabres. Looked amazing when he played with Rasmus Dahlin. Those two on the ice, it's like having 2 extra forwards on the ice that also are so smart that they never let each other get caught off guard. Someone was always back covering for the other. So getting a full season of another dynamic defenseman that can help a Sabres power play that was getting them beat all the time last year. Like, if I could go back 18 games into last year's regular season, I feel like their big offseason move was already made when they traded for Bowen Byram.
Well said there. And the Buffalo Sabres, I think just changing it up had to be something that you were excited about. And then you're hoping as well Tage Thompson gets back to what he produced the year before.
Absolutely.
Brian, you want us to hop in?
Yeah, I just have a question for Joe, and I know he's not a player, but could you also argue like getting Lindy Ruff back behind the bench could be your biggest offseason acquisition? I mean, he saw success with the Buffalo Sabres. I know it was a couple decades ago now, it feels like at this point. So, but I just feel like getting a new head coach behind that bench to try and get what is a very good core over the hump. I think that's huge for you guys.
And I do too. I think I'm very optimistic about Lindy coming in. Like, I think any criticism they get about, oh, you're just bringing in the old coach, like, to me, that's deserved. The organization has set themselves up for that kind of criticism for 13 years. But I do think two things could be true. They could deserve the criticism for just reaching into the well and bringing back the guy they know. And it also could work. And the status of the organization, like, there were reports they tried to get Craig Berube. I just don't think they rate enough as a team right now even to get guys like that. So Lindy's relationship is maybe the only way they could have gotten a coach like that. And when I say a coach like that, it's a guy that's going to hold these guys accountable. And Dahlin was one that was front and center right at the end of the season, talking about how they didn't feel like they were practiced hard enough. They didn't feel like they were held accountable hard enough. And maybe that was considered a shot at Don Granato. I think Granato did a great job developing, but I do think there was a want in the organization, and maybe from some of the leaders like Dahlin, like, man, come on, let's go. This is professional hockey. We shouldn't be, we shouldn't have soft coaching like they were getting. So I think Lindy coming in will establish that. But it's, again, up it's a risk because you don't know how players will react like that. It's one thing to talk about wanting to be held accountable, and then when he's bag skating you in the third week of the season, let's see how much you really like it.
Funny, a little bit of a similarity with the Ottawa Senators last season, albeit on an interim basis, rewinding the clock to their most successful coach in franchise history, hiring Jacques Martin to take over behind the bench in mid-December, right before Christmas. He finished the year, but much like Joe, it's new coaching in Ottawa as well with Travis Green. However, I'd be remiss not to say the biggest addition is Linus Ullmark, stealing all the thunder away from Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final. Trade drops 15 minutes before. But Ullmark, and maybe Joe can speak to this a little bit more, like this guy is better than just being a system goalie with the Boston Bruins. If you go back to the start of Linus Ullmark's career, he's played, I believe, 9 seasons. Well, out of every Senators goalie that's played at least 20 games since Ullmark entered the league, Ullmark has 7 of the 8 best save percentage seasons. One Craig Anderson won the year that Ottawa went to the Eastern Conference Final. Otherwise, it's all Ullmark, a clean sweep. Joe, do you think, I'm putting words in your mouth, but do you think he's more than just a system guy?
I do too. I think he's almost kind of had the opposite ends of the spectrum. I think he had maybe the best system when he was in Boston and won the Vezina, and in part because of it. And then he maybe had the worst system / blue line in the league when he was in Buffalo, and he was putting up, again, not like Vezina numbers, but above average numbers. So if you go like into the weeds on like some of those goals saved above expected numbers when he was in Buffalo, he was a top 10 goaltender during his time here. So in Ottawa, maybe you have a middle ground there. And to me, what that means is you have a reliable number 1 goaltender. I wouldn't bet on him to be an all-star or win the Vezina, but to me, he is a quality goalie in the NHL. And I think of the teams in this division, like it's why I mentioned it when we were talking about the betting odds. I think it could be the move that has the biggest impact on any team that made a move this offseason in the Atlantic.
Especially when you see the Senators ranked dead last in goals saved above expected. So they had the most goals saved below expected, and it was in double digits below the 31st place team. Joonas Korpisalo, as they're calling him in Ottawa, because a lot of 4-goal performances. And Forsberg was a nice, easy one. We just added the U to that. But yeah, Senators goaltending needs to be better if they want a chance. But what if things go wrong? I cringe to think it, but it could be a reality for all 4 of these teams. On the other side, we will discuss what the fallout would be. And I can see Laura smiling because it's just head in the clouds. We got another free year on the bingo card until Demidov comes over from Russia. We'll finish that conversation next. You're listening to a bonus season preview edition of Locked On NHL. It's your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. It's the official ticketing app of the Locked On Podcast Network. I actually just used Game Time last week. I got me and 5 buddies tickets to the Ottawa Senators home opener by using Game Time. And I used the promo code Locked On with a new account, and it was as easy as just getting my order in, and $20 just disappeared right off the bottom. I also love how Game Time has the Game Time pick. So when you have the app, it will just send you things that you would be interested in. No fluff. Nothing 5,000 kilometers away or million miles. It is just in your area. Game Time Picks has it all for you. So as I mentioned, because you're a listener to this podcast, you are entitled to $20 off your first purchase. Just go to the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. So download Game Time, create an account, Locked On NHL, LOCKEDON NHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Game Time today. What time is it? It's game time. Welcome back, Locked On NHL, your team every day. We're a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and here we're all hopeful. Things are going great. The Sens, offseason champs 3 years in a row. It feels like the hype always carries to October, and then it's a direct hit down after winning the home opener the last few years. But things have been bad to worse in Ottawa, and I'll get a little more to what that means if the Senators can't prevail to a playoff spot this season. Laura, do you care at all about the postseason?
I mean, obviously we do, but given that the fact that, the Canadiens are not expected to make the postseason until at least next year, and a wild card, if that, everything this year is a bonus, right? What one player does well, it's a bonus. There's fun games to watch, it's a bonus. Everything just feels like found money right now in Montreal. And if they don't make the playoffs, the consequences are not that dire or negative. It's going to be expected. People are going to grumble a little bit about not having a top 10 pick, maybe. Let's say like they pick 12th or whatever. There'll be a little bit of that. But, I think this season, the biggest thing is people are just hoping that nobody gets injured. There were so many injuries in the past couple of years, just because they want to see some of the core develop together and kind of see what they've got in the chemistry and the pairings, who's going to make the team out of Laval. There's one spot for a defenseman. There's 4 players knocking on that door. There's a lot of like that kind of stuff. So at the end of the season, we're just going to know the answers to those questions, right? There's no downside to this. If they crater another high pick, if they challenge for a wild card, it's fun. We're playing meaningful games in March. But I think at the end of the day, it's all gravy.
Brian, what's the feeling on the Yzer-Plan? This is obviously a franchise legend, a guy who came with so much respect from what he did, building up the Tampa Bay Lightning to the championship pedigree. But now we're going on like 7-8 years. Is the clock starting to tick?
Yeah, so this will be the sixth full season with Steve Yzerman at the helm, and he took over an awful situation. That's been talked to death, right? Like, there was nothing left in the cabinet. Ken Holland left him with awful contracts on the book. Like, let's not forget, Justin Abdelkader stuff and all that. And he came in and he hit 2 home runs on his first 2 picks. He reached for a Cider Calder Trophy winner. He got Lucas Raymond, 4th overall, and he was fantastic last year. Broke out for 70-plus points. And the teams made progress every single year in the standings to the point this last year where they missed the playoffs on a tiebreaker. And now I finally have a problem with the point system now that it affected the Red Wings negatively. I think that if they miss the playoffs this year, what you'll see first and foremost is I think you might actually see Derek Lalonde get canned. I don't think that coming out of the gate there's that much heat on him. And this team has seen 2 steps forward in each years with him behind the bench. But at the same time, both of those years, we saw 2 huge collapses with him behind the bench at some point during the season. So that's why, for me, the consequences of missing the playoffs this year would first and foremost be reassess your head coach. This is a team that has a defensive first head coach whose team doesn't know how to play good defense. So if at the end of the season, this team's not playing better defense and they miss the playoffs again, I think he's probably the first one to go, and I think the heat will really be on Steve Yzerman to make the playoffs after this year. Not many general managers get 6 years of missing the playoffs and not get questioned for it. He gets that because he is who he is to this organization, but if they miss the playoffs again, and even worse, they take a step backwards, it's going to get worse, and I think deservedly so. At some point, the heat has to be turned on underneath Yzerman's seat.
Ottawa, I mean, it's kind of strange to say because it's been so long since they made the playoffs, but the ownership trickle down is going to take a little bit longer than people wanted to. Patience is wearing thin, and this year they built around the core. They insulated them with 2 Stanley Cup champions and Michael Amadio and David Perron, and again, a stabilizer, Nick Jensen, and the goalie we talked about, Linus Ullmark. So if that doesn't work, now all of a sudden you have to look at the core of the team that just did not get it done last year. You look at Tim Stützle, 1 power play goal, 1. And it was in San Jose against the 32nd place team in the league. So they just need internal growth. But if it fails, yeah, there's going to be a lot of eyes on, and I think some might be media driven. Brady Tkachuk came on Locked On Sens this summer and said he loves being in Ottawa, but there's 31 other fan bases that will drum up the what do we need to trade for Brady Tkachuk? It's not working. So that's going to be what happens if it goes wrong for the Ottawa Senators. Hey, you had your chance, Laura. The 2018 draft, he was on the board at 3rd overall, and Jesperi Kotkaniemi was just a little bit ahead on the Habs list. However, Joe, you know a thing or two about high draft picks. What if you get another one this year?
Oh my God. I mean, it'll be same old in some way, right? Like, the Sabres are the team that has dug their fans the biggest hole ever. And you're looking up at everybody else like, oh, this is rock bottom, huh? And just when you think you're at rock bottom, there's the Sabres with the shovel, just digging the hole even more and more and more. You don't think you can keep going lower, but like this team this year, I think you actually might have changes if they don't make the playoffs. I think expectations have been lower. I think the standard has been lower for this franchise than where it should be. But I've got Elliot Friedman on like 3 of his last 4 podcasts talking about how the Sabres know they feel the pressure, that they feel the pressure of this season. They know they have to win. Well, okay, if you're feeling pressure, that means your job's on the line. So, I mean, Kevin Adams, even though he's a Pagula guy, a Terry Pagula guy, he's been working under ownership for a decade plus now. You know, he's been the general manager since 2020. This is year 5 of being the GM. That's about what you get in the NHL. That's actually more than some GMs get. I think the GM might need to make the playoffs this year. And the core group of players who are all buddies and they grew up together and there was this natural organic development that they were going to kind of lead the next, core of Sabres into the postseason. This is their 4th year together. Thompson, Dahlin, Cousins, Tuck, Quinn, like these guys have been together now. This will be year 4. The message to that core group of players is you got to do it now. Like it's time to win, or you guys don't get to play together. You could be best of friends, but it doesn't matter. If you're not getting results, then there will be changes.
What's your final verdict preseason with the Asterix? Who gets in the Atlantic Division?
Can I be boring? Can I just say the top 4 teams that have normally got in? I think I have to do it.
Okay, so you think it'll be 4 and 4 again? 4 from the Metro?
I think it'll be 4 from the Metro again. Although actually, no, you know what? Now that I'm saying that, like, I'm not a big fan of Washington. They're aging. They're getting older. The Islanders, too. Like, I could see Pittsburgh or Philly jumping back in. Or the Devils.
New Jersey, too.
New Jersey, I could see jumping back in. But actually, now that I look at that division, I think there is definitely room for a 5th team to get in. If you're asking me, I might go into my head. I might say Ottawa would be the 5th team.
All right, Laura, who's making it from the Atlantic Division this year for the playoffs?
I'm going to say Detroit, and it's just because I'm also boring, and it's because they were the ones that came the closest last year. And that's just my pick.
So you think that the Metro is going to go down to 3 teams and then the same 4 plus?
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of faith in Pittsburgh or Philly. I know Philly's going to take a step forward. Washington is, I don't even know what they did this offseason. I don't even know if they know what they did this offseason except ruin everybody's life by taking cap friendly away. Pretty much, yeah, like I don't have a whole lot of faith. And New Jersey will find a way to get all the way to February with hope and then just unravel. And it'll be the same as the last couple of years. So I'm just sticking to Detroit because I think they're just going to take a step forward and things hopefully hit right for them. And it's also because it's the team that I hate the least, at least in the division. So.
Brian, did you hit your head celebrating that? I see a tear in your eye.
Let's go. This is a tough one because I agree with Joe. Like the top 4 teams are the top 4 teams. I do really think Boston is poised to take a step back, but just like Joe, I've said that the past 4 years, and they haven't done it yet.
At least Joe did it last year. I did it 2 years ago when they set the all-time record for most points ever.
So Brian's got to do it. We'll take turns picking.
Yeah, you know what? I will do it. I say Boston falls out. I think Boston overpaid for a couple middle of the lineup guys. It's gonna improve their roster marginally, but not in the way they hope, and they're cap strapped because of it. Who knows if Jeremy Swayman can really take on 60 games like they're going to hope he can, unless Jonas Korpisalo becomes a great systems goalie for them.
If he becomes a great system goalie, I'm deactivating every social media account I have. No, so I promise you that.
I will say I think, and because I also have no faith in the Islanders, that team drives me nuts so much. They made the playoffs because they led the league in overtime losses. Yeah. When I was talking about how I don't like the point system, that was why. 16-point overtime losses is why they made the playoffs last year. They had less regulation wins than both the Capitals and the Red Wings. I think the Islanders fall out of the wild card picture. I think Boston slides. I think Detroit, and I think Ottawa. And to be fair, Ross, I predicted your Ottawa Senators to have a great year last year, too. I thought the Red Wings and the Senators would be right next to each other because everything that has been said on this podcast, that the Senators have such a great core of players. Now they have Linus Ullmark, too. Like, it's just been getting out of your own way in terms of making the playoffs for the last
November.
decade.
And they're just out of it so early that it's like there's no point in even paying attention. Now, here, I'll finish off with a little scheduling quirk. So the World Junior Championships are in Ottawa this year. So Ottawa's going on a 13-game road trip. Now, it is split up with the Christmas break, so they will have time to leave and then come back. And I think their last game, they'll fly home and go back. But with that, 10 of their last 11 games are at home, and their 1 road game's in Columbus. So the building is either going to be as packed as it's ever been, or there's going to be 5,000 people there each and every night. There's no in-between with how the Senators are going into this season. But I'm going to be boring, too. I'll be the most boring, and I'll say it's the 4 teams that got before and nobody else. So Florida, Tampa, Toronto, and the Boston Bruins. You'll hear from those four hosts in another roundtable. We'll hand it over to that. For now, we say goodbye. For more, of course, you can subscribe to Locked On Canadiens, Locked On Detroit Red Wings, Locked On Sabres, Locked On Senators, and of course, Locked On NHL. Laura, Joe, Brian, pleasure chatting with you all tonight. This has been a special season preview edition of Locked On NHL, your team every day.